We perceive the world through patterns, and through those patterns, our brain generates a model of the world. And our brain prefers to use predictions that go along with our previous models. New information which requires us to update our assumptions has a cost, and so our brain just prefers to see the world in the same way that it did before. With the use of social media, this creates new challenges because social media really creates this confirmation bias where we end up getting the information or the news that substantiates our understanding of the world. It creates these echo chambers. It also highly changes our idea of prevalence rates and our understanding of what is actually going on in the world. The problem with social media is that it relies on the aesthetic component to portray news. So for example, it relies on the shock value. You see a lot of these videos, you see a lot of these data visualizations which are incorrectly done. And so that completely changes your perception of what is actually going on. And this is very hard to counterbalance because it is a very costly process to actually go through the data, to look at the numbers and fully understand them. Another issue is that, as Daniel Kahneman has shown, our statistical brain isn't that good. We have a lot of trouble understanding percentages and actually formulating good statistical knowledge. In this video, I will be focusing on the issues that we encounter in statistical presentation and many of the ways that news outlets and others do to manipulate data and present them in ways which aren't actually correct. And so first, it is important to start with the goal of statistics, which is essentially to collect, organize, summarize, present, and analyze data. And in today's video, I will be focusing on the presenting part, which has a lot of issues. All the other steps also have their issues. And if, for example, you collect crappy data, then you will essentially be sort of ruining all of the other processes. So assuming that you have collected good data, you can still do a pretty bad job. You can still present that good data in a terrible way. So I'll be focusing on some of the issues pertaining to that. Starting with the idea of data visualization, which is presenting data in a visual form, one of the main issues that I often see is, for example, in scatter plots or other types of visual constructions, the use where the y-axis starts is often an issue. So, for example, if people want to emphasize small changes and try to portray them as very large changes to support a certain narrative, they might play a little bit around with the y-axis. So a lot of times you might see that graphs the y-axis doesn't start at 0. So it might start at a much higher interval to emphasize small changes and make them seem that they're very large. This is often used in politics to support a certain agenda, and it is one of the big issues that I often see with data visualization. Another issue, which once again is very common with data visualization, is the use of the time period. Many times the time period chosen omits past data, which is actually very important to understand the full context of the progression, the temporal progression of a certain trend. And once again, this is very problematic because it is used to manipulate your understanding of, for example, economic data. So you might have a graph which just focuses on the time period, but it's omitting data prior to that, which actually provides you the context to fully understand the actual trends in the economy. Additionally, in news reporting, you also find a very big issue, which is the complete disregard for differentiating between relative and absolute probabilities. What do I mean by this? You might hear or read certain news which say, for example, that X, if you do X, you have, for example, a 30% probability of developing cancer. The problem with that presentation is that oftentimes that actual percentage is not an absolute percentage. So it is not your actual probability of developing cancer, it's a relative probability. But let's assume that the absolute probability for developing a certain type of cancer is, for instance, like 2%. This means that if you have 30% more probability than the 2% which is the absolute probability for a general population or control group, that means that although it seems like 30% is a lot, in terms of absolute terms, it's not. It's actually very little. So in news reporting, this is useful as fear-mongering or to sensationalize a certain thing, and it just is a very manipulative tactic. So when looking at news reporting, when you're looking at articles, please try to understand whether you are dealing with absolute probabilities or relative probabilities, because most of the time you will most likely be dealing with relative probabilities. So keep that in mind. Another issue which we often see when we are looking at data is that, for example, once again, we have a headline that says that, for example, a certain drug has this outstanding effect on alleviating some symptom or actually in treating a certain condition. But something which isn't often mentioned, especially in news outlets, is the sample size for that study. We know there are a lot of issues with sample size, and part of the replication crisis in science is due to that principle, which is some studies are using statistical methods which are actually very underpowered because you don't have a sufficient sample size to actually generate valid conclusions regarding your original question. So understanding whether a certain sample is underpowered or sufficiently powered is crucial. And this, once again, is to some extent costly, because let's say you're reading some news article and they're just presenting the data like this. To understand what the sample size is, you would need to go to the study and actually check it. If you are someone who doesn't do science for a living, this is of course costly, and you don't want to be fact-checking everything, because at the end of the day you have some trust with the way that a certain news outlet is presenting the data, but unfortunately there is a lot of manipulation, and sometimes it's not even manipulation, it's just a misunderstanding of how to present statistical findings, and this leads to a completely wrong understanding of what that original data means. So my advice here for those of you who are not in science is for topics where you believe that are extremely important to you, or if you are very interested in something where, actually trying to understand whether that data is correct or not, then try to visit the original studies which have been presented or used in that news reporting, and try to understand how the study was done. Normally a good study has a very nice abstract, so through the abstract you should get a gist of the study. And if you're very interested, of course, it is always better to at least give a full read to the article, but this is just a recommendation that I often give. Finally, another issue is the classic causation versus correlation dilemma, in which in some news reporting you have that A causes B. The problem here is that we are mostly, if not entirely, dealing with correlations. We never actually find a true causation. This is especially true in biology, where you have so many different variables, so many different things which may be contributing to the actual observed phenomena, that you cannot surely state that what you are observing is causation. I mean, even if you look at psychiatric dominations, you normally consider, for example, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia as syndromes. They are classified as syndromes because we don't really know their root cause. We don't really know what causes those certain conditions. There are, of course, strong correlations. For example, we know that poor sleep enhances the affective issues which are related to depression. We might say that these correlations are so strong that there may be actually causations, but from a purely statistical understanding, we cannot claim that these are causes. We can say that we have very strong correlations, but we cannot fully state that. Additionally, one of the issues is that sometimes when doing statistical analyses and then presenting those same results, oftentimes there are confounding variables which we are not taking into account. Many times we have exhausted a lot of the possibilities and we think that we have covered our bases, but these confounding variables, which are variables which can affect the target variable which we are studying, there's always a room for error there where we may not be accounting for extremely important variables. So this is why it is important to understand statistics. I think statistical literacy is something which is extremely important. In the previous decade, there has been a lot of conversation about coding literacy, that it is very important to learn coding languages, and I fully support that. But I think even more now as we evolve, it is even more important to have some degree of statistical literacy, because data is being used all around to manipulate us, to think certain things, and if we don't look at it with a more careful eye, then we might just be being manipulated, and sometimes, of course, that manipulation doesn't have any sort of effect. It is not crucial. But the problem with this is that in order for us to make informed decisions about the world, in order for us to actually know what is the best action in a certain situation, we need our pattern detection mechanisms and our hypothesis generating mechanisms to be functioning well. And understanding statistics and knowing how to read it is extremely important. So keep that in mind, and let me know in the comments if you have any good examples of statistical manipulation, or if you want me to do more videos regarding this topic. Thank you very much.